To the whiteboard. So before we completely leave the digestive system, I don't think I ever quite kind of tied up the liver. You know, the liver deserves to be spoken about specifically, just because it does so many things and it's so important. And it doesn't really fit into any particular system really, because it plays roles in lots of different systems. So let's just, in a nutshell, talk a bit about all the different things the liver's doing. So when you think about the liver, you have a kind of more comprehensive understanding of it. So let's talk about, we've talked about lots of things the liver does. What are some of the things the liver is doing?
It's processing and detoxifying blood that comes from the stomach.
Yeah, so totally. So it's, remember, all the stuff that's getting absorbed from the digestive tract goes to the liver first. So this is going to be processed nutrients. Well, let me get a smaller font here. Processed nutrients. And by processed nutrients, this can be store nutrients and vitamins. The liver cells are the ones that are taking in carbohydrates and storing them as glycogen in their cells. So when your blood sugar is dropping down, the liver can turn on an enzyme that breaks apart that glycogen and releases sugar back into your bloodstream. The liver can store all sorts of other vitamins, so they're there if you need them. So it stores nutrients and vitamins, can interconvert. Nutrients, right? If you have one particular amino acid, but you need another, it has the enzymes often to make the thing you need. So it's also going to process wastes, detoxify wastes. When you get into pharmacology later, you're going to learn all about the core enzyme systems in the liver that are the ones that break down. When you take a drug, the reason it doesn't just stay effective forever is the moment it's in your body, the liver enzymes usually are starting to dismantle it and deactivate it. So the liver is doing a lot of that. The liver is where, when you go into anaerobic respiration and you build up lots of lactic acid, the liver is what kind of takes that and puts it back into forms that you can feed back into normal cellular respiration. So it's doing all sorts of things, both with just metabolic byproducts as well as with, actual chemicals that come into your body that need to be broken down. So process, detoxify waste. It's filtering, the blood. It's got these macrophages. There's these fixed macrophages, big eaters, and they're called Kupffer cells. Some macrophages are just on patrol. They're just going in through the connective tissue, finding what they can find. Some macrophages are the dust cells that are localized in your lung tissue. The Kupffer cells are the population that are localized in your liver. And they can just reach in. Those sinusoidal capillaries in the liver actually just have breaks in the walls. They're not really regular capillaries at all. So the macrophages come in, they can just grab stuff out of your bloodstream. These are the ones that are recycling worn out red blood cells. If I can spell. So stuff like that the liver's doing. Other things, talking about blood, I don't know if you remember when we talked about plasma proteins. This basically makes all those plasma proteins. You know, this is the one that's making fibrinogen and thrombin and angiotensinogen and all the complement proteins and all of that stuff. What's the only plasma protein the liver doesn't make?
Gamma globulins.
Exactly, the gamma globulins, the antibodies. Antibodies which are made by which cells? You should definitely know that.
B cells.
Yeah, the B cells, particularly the plasma cells, the B lymphocytes. So liver, processing nutrients, storing nutrients, interconverting things, detoxifying things, filtering the blood, recycling red blood cells, making plasma proteins. Again, liver, super important. You know, you can live without a spleen. You can't live without a liver. In fact, the liver basically is doing what the spleen does, which is kind of filtering the blood, but so much more. Liver, highly regenerative. If you have like an acute insult to the liver, it can usually recover pretty well. Like I mentioned earlier, and I had Hep A, my liver got thrashed, but a year later, you know, everything was fine. People who have constant insults to their liver, like through alcoholism, where you're overwhelming its ability to detoxify, and eventually the cells are starting to get poisoned in the liver. And then the cells ultimately get replaced by connective tissue and fat. You know, then the liver takes a hit and it's going to lose functionality. But if you have something that, or if I think I don't know if I've told, like I had a friend who donated, I had one friend who had liver cancer and another friend willing to give a liver transplant. And the way they did it was they took half a liver out of the donor and they put that into the recipient, and both half livers basically regrew into fully functional livers. So it's kind of amazing. You can just take a half a liver out of you and stick it in someone else, and both those halves, kind of like a planarian or something, right? You cut a planarian in half and you get two little worms out of it. So highly regenerative. So that's the liver. Just kind of wanted, I wouldn't feel kind of responsible if we finish the class without at least spending a little bit of time giving the liver a bit of due. Okay, now we'll go on to the endocrine system. So endocrine system. So we've already seen hormones in this class, right? Hormones, they're basically released, you know, into the bloodstream. You know, and any cell that has the appropriate receptor is going to have a response, right? This is super different than neurotransmitters. You know, neurotransmitters, you've got like some axon terminal releasing some neurotransmitter that's meeting some receptor right there. You know, let's say this is like serotonin or something, right? But there are serotonin receptors on neurons all over your brain, but only the neuron that's right in the synapse is actually getting the message. With hormones, you release it and it's just broadcast everywhere in your body. You know, we saw that initially with adrenaline, epinephrine. You dump epinephrine into the bloodstream and every cell in your body that has that appropriate adrenergic receptor will respond. Your heart will speed up. Your bronchial passages dilate. Your pupils dilate, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Your sweat glands turn on and you get all sweaty. We saw hormones are important in the control of digestive processes. You know, we saw gastrin controls actually the secretion of, you know, gastric juices by the gastric glands. We saw CCK and secretin are pulling the strings on the pancreas and the gallbladder to secrete digestive juices into the small intestine. So hormones aren't just about, you know, the pituitary gland or something. They're used all over. We have things we're not going to get into. The heart, like the atria. We talked about the heart. We talked about ways to increase blood pressure, like with renin-angiotensin mechanism. Like if the atria are getting overstretched, which would mean that blood pressure is too high, the heart itself releases a hormone. It's like atrial natriuretic peptide that actually tries to bring your blood pressure back down. You know, so your heart even releases hormones to try to adjust blood pressure if it feels it's getting too stretched out. So just kind of putting that out there, like, you know, endocrine system, this idea of hormones, you know, their hormones are used by lots of different organs to control lots of different things in your body. What we're going to focus on right now are a few of the organs that are primarily endocrine organs, you know, like your pituitary gland, your adrenal glands, your thyroid gland, your parathyroid glands. But don't think about hormones just being involved with, you know, specifically endocrine glands. So, you know, we're going to start with the pituitary gland. You know, this one's often kind of called the master gland. You know, because we're going to see it controls lots of other glands. And it, in turn, is being controlled by what? What controls the pituitary gland?
The hypothalamus.
Yeah, the hypothalamus. So this is going to be this major connection between your nervous system and your endocrine system. We'll talk a little more about that. You know, we've already dealt with the pineal. We won't go back there. We've talked about the thymus. We're not going to go back there. We'll talk about the thyroid, the parathyroid, which is right near the thyroid, or it's actually on the thyroid, but it's its own gland. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the adrenal glands. And this is going to be both the medulla, which we've already mentioned, and the cortex, which we have not really talked about much. You know, and then we're going to talk about the gonads, and this will be riffing further on into the reproductive system. And we've also talked a bit about the pancreas as a exocrine gland to make the digestive juices, but we'll talk a little more about it as an endocrine gland because it is important for your glucose regulation. So those are the ones we're going to look at. Before we dive in, we should talk just a few of the kind of more overarching concepts in the endocrine system about what kind of hormones there are and what controls the release of hormones. So let's talk about that. Let's start with types of hormones. So some are amino acid based. This includes like peptides. So some, you know, like insulin. Insulin is just 37 amino acids connected together. It's, you know, a peptide, a small chain of amino acids. So sometimes they are peptides. Other ones, right, remember like the catecholamines. Like epinephrine was like 2 enzymatic steps away from tyrosine. It starts with amino acid, but then you like tweak it a little bit. So either a chain of amino acids or based on initially an amino acid. Some of the important hormones are literally just like 7 amino acids long. They're really dinky little peptides, but play critical roles in your body. These obviously dissolve in water. These are hydrophilic. So they can just dissolve in your bloodstream. They are going to bind to receptors that are just sitting on the membrane of a cell. Here's like, let's say this is my target cell. These guys here that are hydrophilic and can just dissolve in the plasma and then diffuse out into the interstitial fluid and then just bind to receptors sitting on the target cell on their outer membrane there. So the receptors for these kind of hormones are going to be on the outside of the cell. The other major class of hormones are steroid hormones. So these are derived from cholesterol. So obviously that makes them lipids. That makes them hydrophobic. So what does that mean if you're a hydrophobic molecule and you want to move through the plasma, through the bloodstream, which is what hormones do? How do
you need a carrier?
You need a carrier, exactly. So with steroid hormones, like when you're talking about them more physiologically and pharmacologically, you talk about both bound and free. Like you're talking about testosterone or estrogen or something, you'll talk about bound, how much of it is currently in your body, but bound to a carrier and not actually active and available to act at a receptor, versus free, the stuff that's actually able to go and do something at a receptor. So when you, so just as you go forward in the future, you're going to talk about bound and free hormone when you're talking about steroid hormones, and it's just talking about bound to carriers, in which case it's being transported, versus free, it's been let go and it can actually do something. If you remember hydrophobic things, or the other word for hydrophobic is lipophilic, right? Because if you're afraid of water, you like lipids. These things can just move right through the cell membrane. In fact, they move right through the nuclear envelope. And these tend to bind receptors actually in the nucleus of the cell. So that's pretty different than these other dudes. So they go all the way in and they manage to bind receptors in the nucleus. Often turning on like more long-term like changes, turning on protein synthesis and cell division and this and that. So they're often doing more developmental stuff. The receptors in here, they're really different and weird compared to the receptors that we've talked about. We talked about the classic receptors, G protein mediated receptors on the cell membrane. Like when I was showing you that PowerPoint at the beginning of the semester, showing you the serotonin receptor. That's a pretty typical receptor for a regular membrane receptor, but the ones in the nucleus, they're very complicated and strange with many subunits that disassemble and reassemble. And so we're not going to talk about it at all. In fact, it's a whole realm that I barely am familiar with, but just to let you know that the receptors in the nucleus for these steroid hormones are a whole different beast than, I mean, they still have ligand binding and all that, but the mechanisms are very different from what we've seen before. We looked at what does it mean to do signal transduction. So there's a whole other world that you can explore in there. Yeah, one of my friends looks at estrogen receptors at Genentech looking for targets for breast cancer and stuff. And so I've gotten some insight into these receptors and enough to know that they're really, really complicated and different from the receptors I'm more used to working with. So steroids versus amino acid-based types of hormones. The other kind of general overarching concept we should mention is what things actually trigger hormone release. So we'll say control of hormone release. So what kind of things will trigger a hormone to release from either an endocrine gland or from some organ that releases hormones?
Change in like blood pressure?
So things like blood pressure. So I would lump that into like environmental stimuli. Environment meaning the internal environment. Your blood pressure, how stretched out your atria is, if your sugar is up or down, if your calcium is up or down. Different things that are about the condition of your body will often be used to control hormones. So that's one thing, environmental stimuli.
Foods?
What's that?
What you eat?
So that would be environmental stimuli, right? Because that would be like the appearance of different molecules in your body. So for sure, like, yeah, eating sugar is going to cause the release of insulin, but I would kind of lump that into this one. So with the sympathetic nervous system, remember we saw how the sympathetic nervous system could trigger a dump of epinephrine, right? So you can have just neural control. Right? Your sympathetic nervous system just tells your adrenal medulla, dump epinephrine into your body. So that's another one. And then the other one, which we're going to see is really important, and we'll see many examples of before this week is out, is what we call tropic hormones. By tropic hormones, we mean hormones that control the release of other hormones. We're going to see that this can often happen on many levels. One hormone A will trigger the release of hormone B, and hormone B will trigger the release of hormone C, and hormone C is going to go back and inhibit the release of hormone A or B. And we're going to see all these crazy either feedback loops and control loops with hormones that are affecting each other. So this is going to be really ongoing theme that we're going to be seeing again and again both when we just talk about hormone and endocrine system in general, and then lots of specific examples when we get into the reproductive system, when we look what's happening between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the testes or the ovaries. Or in the case of the woman, the uterus as well. So that's the kind of big picture that we are gonna kind of start with. Definitely want to think about what controls hormone release. Sometimes it's just stuff in your body. You know, glucose just showed up, or we don't got enough calcium. We need more calcium. Sometimes there's a neural control. Sometimes your nervous system just sends out the signal and you got adrenaline dumped into your bloodstream. But this one's going to be really common. The idea that something is going to release a hormone that talks to yet another gland, which releases some other hormone, which might do something directly or might actually talk to yet another gland and release some other hormone. So let us continue on then. All right, so we're gonna, and I'm gonna kind of I'm gonna have to go through this relatively quickly since there's not so much time left and still quite a bit to cover, but I will do my best to be clear. Pituitary gland. It's also called the hypophysis. Right? And if you've been in anatomy, you know we call it the hypophysis. But since we're in physiology, we'll call it the pituitary gland. So here is the hypothalamus, the brain. This is the brain. There's this little stalk, the infundibulum. The pituitary gland itself has two parts. It's got this more anterior part, which is more kind of classic glandular tissue. It's got this back part, the posterior pituitary, which is actually, and it's also called the neurohypophysis. The posterior pituitary isn't actually glandular tissue. It's actually, there are neurons in the hypothalamus that send their axons down and basically they release the hormones. So the posterior pituitary, the hormones aren't actually made in the posterior pituitary. They're actually made in the hypothalamus and kind of delivered down this through axons. Anterior pituitary, on the other hand, actually makes its own hormones. But the anterior pituitary is still controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases hormones that talk to the anterior pituitary to control it. So they call them releasing hormones. These are usually small peptides, just a few like 7 or 8 amino acids long. For instance, I'm going to say, like, for example, let me. So there are lots of releasing hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. There's going to be growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropic releasing hormone, this and that. There's lots of different releasing hormones. You are not responsible for knowing the names of all the releasing hormones. You should know that there are releasing hormones, that the hypothalamus releases hormones. And again, they actually get delivered directly down through, it's called the hypophyseal portal system. There's like actually capillaries in the hypothalamus that deliver into capillaries in the pituitary. So there's this really like direct delivery of these releasing hormones. Gonadotropin releasing hormone you are going to have to know about because it's at the core of control of both male and female reproductive systems. So when we talk about, when we get into the female monthly cycle, it starts with gonadotropin releasing hormone going up from the hypothalamus. And that's going to be the beginning of the whole monthly cycle. In guys, rather than cycles, you just get pulses of gonadotropin releasing hormone, which are going to cause the constant production of sperm and testosterone and stuff. So we're going to see gonadotropin releasing hormone quite a bit over this coming week. So you should be familiar with it. But you should know that it is just part of a larger family that we call releasing hormones that are going to be talking to the pituitary, particularly the anterior pituitary, and triggering the release of all sorts of stuff.
Did
So
you say that the anterior can produce its own hormones, but
Yeah.
not the posterior?
Yeah, the anterior pituitary is more, it's more classic epithelial derived glandular tissue. So here you have the cells they're triggered by the releasing hormones, but then they make their hormone and release it. Whereas in the posterior pituitary, rather than having cells to make hormones, it's actually just extensions of neurons that start in the hypothalamus and just deliver the hormones down into there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so what we're gonna do now is look at the posterior and anterior pituitary and talk about the specific hormones that they release. We'll start with the posterior pituitary because it's a little more, there's only two. And one of them you already know really, really, really well, so we don't have to spend any time here. It makes ADH, if I can spell it. Antidiuretic hormone.
The posterior.
The posterior. And if you remember, it's also known as vasopressin, which makes sense. It increases your blood pressure, right? We talked about ADH. What does ADH do? ADH has a variety of roles.
It tells your kidneys to retain water.
Exactly. It tells them to retain. And how does it do that? What's the actual mechanism?
The vasoconstrictor?
So it is a vasoconstrictor as well, but let's get back to the kidney just for a moment.
The collecting ducts, right? It has the aquaporins that.
Yeah, so it tells it inserts aquaporins in the collecting duct, which causes the kidney to suck more water back out of the filtrate into the body. And it's also it's a vasoconstrictor. That's part of how it adjusts your blood pressure. We also talked about it talking to your hypothalamus and triggering your thirst response. So, we've talked about ADH out the wazoo at this point. The other thing made here is oxytocin. Sometimes people talk about it being kind of the cuddle hormone. Oxytocin is associated with a lot of kind of bonding, social bonding and nurturing behaviors. It's released like, after orgasm, that kind of, kind of warm, fuzzy, everything's all right kind of place. Oxytocin is released, actually, they've shown now with like dogs and owners, when they lock gaze and they look lovingly into each other's eyes, you get a mutual release of oxytocin in both the dog and in the owner. So it's not just social bonding and like, warm fuzzies between humans even. It is also, like in the work I've been doing, it's been implicated in part of why MDMA is useful in therapy. Because MDMA, like ecstasy, one of the things, among other things, it stimulates oxytocin release, which creates this kind of more kind of safe, everything's okay kind of feeling where people are more likely to go into difficult material and be able to process it more easily. Have more of a rapport and safety with their therapist. Oxytocin is also important in childbirth. This is what triggers uterine contractions. So in fact, it's one of the few positive feedback loops in the body where as labor begins and the uterus starts contracting, trying to like deliver the baby, oxytocin is what's causing those muscular contractions. And the more those continue, it actually triggers even more oxytocin release, which gives you even stronger contractions, and even more oxytocin release, with even stronger contractions. And ultimately, obviously, it's going to end when the baby pops out, hopefully. If you want to induce labor, you give them a shot of tocin. This is basically how you induce labor, is by artificially inducing this into the woman's body. This also does milk letdown. The mammary glands kind of make the milk, but the oxytocin kind of triggers the little muscles and stuff that squirt the milk out. So, there's stories of women who are currently nursing and they're just kind of hanging out and just hear a baby cry and all of a sudden milk starts coming out. Also, partly during nursing, the oxytocin is for the nursing, but then it also will cause the uterine contractions that will help kind of bring the uterus back to where, not all the way back, but close. It got really stretched out during pregnancy. So while a woman's nursing, that oxytocin, in addition to doing the milk letdown, is also contracting the uterus and starting to kind of help it get back to a smaller size. So oxytocin, and again, it's been implicated in non-human animals as well. Like there's all sorts of studies, even like looking at rodents, where they have all sorts of social bonding and nurturing that is coordinated with oxytocin. So oxytocin. Let's now go to the anterior pituitary. I'm going to go to another page because this is going to get too messy. So again, we're in the anterior pituitary here. So we can start. There's a bunch of tropic hormones that are released here. So let's start with the tropic hormones. One is called thyroid stimulating hormone. Known as TSH. Wah! Maybe we should just call it t-shirt. If you write t-shirt on your exam, it'll be fine. No, I'm joking. Dag nabbit. This, for a smart thing, it does not that smart. It's like if you type the same thing the exact same way, like 4 times, you think it's gonna like have some little algorithm, like maybe that's what it wants to do. All right. Thyroid stimulating hormone. It is exactly what it sounds like. It talks to your thyroid gland and stimulates the secretion of the thyroid hormone. We're going to talk about it later in more detail when we get to the thyroid gland. But again, you have thyrotropin releasing hormone. So there's a releasing hormone that triggers the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. And then this is going to go and talk to your thyroid gland to release its hormone. So there's like 2 levels here of one hormone controlling this releasing hormone, controlling the TSH controlling the thyroid hormone. And there's going to be a feedback where the more you have thyroid hormone, that's going to tell the pituitary, oh, we got enough, we don't need so much of this. So there'll be these negative feedback loops going on. So we'll look at those in more detail. So thyroid stimulating hormone, another one is adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH. And this stimulates the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal gland, well, when we get to it in a few moments, we'll see it has 2 important different parts. It's got the adrenal medulla, the middle part, which we've already met, which releases the epinephrine, the adrenaline. But then there's an outer part, which is the adrenal cortex, which makes a variety of steroid hormones, some which we've seen, some which we haven't. It's like where aldosterone is made. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, although it's a mouthful, you could just call it ACTH, stimulates the adrenal cortex. Again, tropic hormone because it is stimulating the release of other hormones by another gland. And again, it is controlled by other releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. Next, we're going to have what we collectively call the gonadotropins. But maybe I'll capitalize it because it's I'll capitalize it and make it bigger. So the gonadotropins. The gonadotropins, which again are controlled from here by gonadotropin releasing hormone, is going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to release the gonadotropins. And there are 2 important gonadotropins. And both of these are going to be really major players as we get deeper and deeper into the reproductive system. So I'm going to spend a little more time going into each one in detail. So these are both considered gonadotropins. These are the 2 hormones that are considered the gonadotropins. One is called follicle stimulating hormone. FSH. We're going to talk much more about what the follicle is in a little bit when we get deeper into the reproductive system and the ovaries. But basically, the egg, the ovum, is never just on its own. It's always accompanied by other supporting cells. In that whole structure, the egg and the supporting cells is called the follicle. So this is basically, promoting development of egg, in the ovary, And then obviously in a guy, it's got to do something different. It's going to be promoting, development of sperm in the testes if you're in a guy. And like I said, the egg is not on its own. We have like our ovum and then all these other supporting cells around it that we're going to talk about in more detail. And this whole structure collectively is the follicle. So when we watch the egg developing in the ovary, it's not just going to be the egg is getting more complicated and developing. It's also going to be these other cells, the follicular cells, granulosa cells, thecal cells, creating this more complicated structure known as a follicle. And even once the egg is ovulated, the thing that's going down the fallopian tube, the thing that the sperm meets, is surrounded by cells, the corona radiata that it has to like break through in order to actually get to the egg. Like the sperm goes to the egg. It's not like, oh, it's all good. It's like, oh crap, there's a big wall of cells I got to break on through to actually get to the egg. So, whereas sperm we'll see are much simpler. They're just little wiggly individual cells swimming around doing their thing. A 2. The other gonadotropin is luteinizing hormone, LH. LH, so in the female, triggers ovulation. So luteinizing hormone, there's going to be a big spike of luteinizing hormone at mid-cycle, like 2 weeks into the monthly cycle, and that is going to cause the follicle pops. The egg gets spewed out into the, hopefully collected up by the fallopian tube and goes on its journey. The remains of the follicle, the other cells, become this structure called the corpus luteum that we're going to talk about in a few moments. So triggers ovulation and formation of corpus luteum. Which makes progesterone. We're going to, again, look at this in more detail, but that's basically a new structure now that exists in the ovary that is going to make progesterone, and that tells the body that we just ovulated, all systems are go, keep the uterine lining intact because we might have a potential pregnancy coming up. So as long as progesterone stays high, the body knows like, we've got to keep everything ready to go for a potential pregnancy. If after a week and a half, nothing's happened, there's no signal that a pregnancy is happening, the progesterone is going to drop. And that's actually going to be when the whole uterine lining sloughs off and, the woman starts her menstrual flow. So we'll look at that in more detail, but basically the luteinizing hormone is what starts that whole process of triggering ovulation and then making the structure that makes progesterone to tell the body to be prepared for a pregnancy. Guys are way simpler. In males, stimulates testosterone production. So, there'll still be some kind of, we'll talk a bit about the feedback loops and things like that. So it's not going to be totally simple, but in general, we're going to spend a lot more time looking at the kind of hormonal cycling and interactions in the female than in the guy. And partly because it involves more structures too. It's not just about getting the gametes out there. It's also about getting the uterus prepared to nurture a potential pregnancy. So the gonadotropins, follicle stimulating luteinizing hormone. Again, we will meet both of these in much more detail very soon. So those are the tropic hormones then. The tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary are the thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and these gonadotropins, FSH and LH. There are two other hormones from the anterior pituitary that you should know. Oops. So I'm putting a line here because these are the tropic hormones. These are things that are not tropic hormones. There's also GH, growth hormone. Which is what it sounds like. It stimulates growth, cell division, metabolism. It's you need a certain amount of it just to kind of maintain your tissues and stuff like that. This is like a good example of we can use to talk about a lot of pathologies, a lot of endocrine pathologies. They can come down to either hyposecretion or hypersecretion. Hypo meaning you're not secreting enough. Hyper meaning you're secreting too much. You know, and that can happen through different mechanisms. A common mechanism for hyposecretion actually gets back to the immune system we've just been talking about. Remember we talked about how autoimmune disease is where you attack your own tissue. Hyposecretion, like type 1 diabetes, happens because your immune system attacks your own pancreas, the cells that makes the insulin in your pancreas, so they don't secrete enough insulin. Hyposecretion can be Hashimoto's syndrome, where you attack your thyroid gland and you don't secrete enough thyroid hormone. So sometimes you have not enough secretion because, for whatever reason, often because your own immune system has taken out your endocrine tissue. Hypersecretion, on the other hand, is if you're making too much. This often happens like from a tumor, for instance. A tumor is where you have uncontrolled cell growth. If some of those cells that are dividing when they shouldn't are endocrine cells that make hormones, you're going to start making way too much of the hormone in your body. So if you have hyposecretion, I kind of got off of this from GH, growth hormone. If you have hyposecretion of growth hormone when you're developing, you don't grow very much. You stay very small. You get what's called like pituitary dwarfism. This is different from like when you think about, I forget the dude's name from Game of Thrones, like Lannister guy. Was it, what was his name?
Tyrion Lannister.
Yeah, so like he is, exhibits dwarfism, but it's like the body proportions are, kind of very different from kind of your classic body proportions. Pituitary dwarfism, the person has all the normal body proportions, but it's just really small, really short. That's if you have hyposecretion. Hypersecretion, you get pituitary gigantism. where people just get growing taller and taller and taller, 7 feet or more, and to where you actually can get so tall if you don't stop it that the person has trouble supporting their own weight. So it's obvious something they have to catch and they have to deal with, or else the person can actually get too big to actually have their musculoskeletal system be able to function correctly. So just this idea, hyposecretion, hypersecretion, and give a sense of, in growth hormone, if you get too much growth hormone as an adult, you can't get taller because your epiphyseal plates have already closed, but you can actually still get your bone, flat bones can continue widening out. So like, it's actually been used as a performance enhancing drug for athletes because it does bulk out your muscles and things like that. But then the people start looking weird because their face starts getting all wider and things like that, because it does create bone growth. Even if they're not getting taller, their flat bones start widening out. There's this thing, if it happens just as a disease, it's called acromegaly. Acromegaly is if you have too much of this as an adult after your bone. You can't grow taller, but it still kind of messes with you. Okay, back to where we were. Growth hormone. And then the other one is prolactin, which is kind of what it promotes lactation. Typically the mammary glands are in this just kind of kind of suspended state. They're not actually active making milk, but the prolactin kind of wakes them up and gets them ready to go.
The GH and the prolactin, those are both tropic hormones still?
No.
No.
Right? No, because a tropic hormone promotes the release of another hormone. Neither of these is promoting the release of a hormone. Growth hormone is affecting cell division and growth and things. Prolactin is stimulating mammary glands to start becoming, active, but making milk, not make a hormone.
Okay.
And there are other hormones involved, we're not going to get into. There are hormones made by the placenta later on that actually like loosen up your joints to make it more likely that your hip bones will shift and the baby will be able to make it out, without getting stuck and stuff like that. There's so many other hormones, but so this is the pituitary, anterior pituitary, tropic hormones, super important. Gonadotropins, which we are going to follow in much more detail. Also, these hormones that are not tropic, but important, growth hormone, and this prolactin. Okay.
Dr. Eager?
Uh-huh.
It's hard to see the very bottom line. I think the screen gets cut off because there's like a little tab that comes up that says, that has like the mute and the stop video. That just says prolactin. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, anterior pituitary, if you're in anatomy, it's the adeno hypophysis. The posterior pituitary is the neuro hypophysis. So if you're reading about this in other books, you might see different names. So let us now go and continue with our cavalcade of glands. We're gonna get some thyroid gland. right? So if you remember, you had, here's your larynx, your trachea, your lungs, bronchi going into your lungs. This is supposed to be your respiratory system. The thyroid gland is kind of sitting right under your larynx here. Kind of right, kind of like the bottom part of your neck. It makes two main types of hormones. It makes a thyroid hormone. Sometimes they call it thyroxine, which thyroxine is actually kind of two things. There's T3 and T4. Maybe I'm going to type it out. It'll be faster. Triiodothyronine and tetra, which just means 4-iodothyronine. You don't need to remember the names tetraiodothyronine and triiodothyronine, but you do need to remember the iodo. These need iodine to make them. So that's an important part of the thyroid gland, is it needs iodine to make its hormones. It concentrates iodine like 200 times the normal amount as the rest of your body tissues. In fact, if you're hyperthyroid and they need to try to kill off your thyroid tissue, one of the ways, instead of going and surgically going in and cutting it out, they'll give people radioactive iodine. And it'll be a low enough level that it won't really hurt your other tissues, but it'll get really concentrated in your thyroid and kill off your thyroid gland cells. So iodine, if you don't have enough iodine in your body, you're not going to make enough thyroid hormone. That's when you get goiter. Goiter is if your thyroid gland is trying to make its thyroid hormone, but if there's not enough iodine, there's not enough thyroid hormone showing up, in which case we go back and the pituitary gland is saying, wait a second, I make TSH and I'm making thyroid stimulating hormone. Not enough thyroid hormone, so let's up production of thyroid stimulating hormone and tell the thyroid gland to make more. And it does that, and the poor little thyroid gland starts growing more tissue, getting bigger so it can make more thyroid hormone. But without the iodine, it's not doing it. So even though the thyroid gland is enlarging, we're not getting an additional amount of thyroid hormone in the body, which means we're back at the pituitary gland, and the pituitary is like, oh my God, still not enough thyroid hormone. Let's like even more thyroid stimulating hormone. Keep this going. We need to tell this thyroid gland to do its job. And eventually you can actually just start see this whole bulge showing up at the base of the neck. As the thyroid gland gets so big, you can actually see it bulging, just superficially. You can see this overgrown thyroid gland. That's called goiter. That happens if you don't get adequate iodine in your diet, which isn't so much of a problem now. You get like iodized salt and things like that. What does thyroid hormone do? This kind of controls metabolic rate. There's kind of a sweet spot of kind of running all the kind of, especially kind of energy producing chemical reactions in your body at a certain rate that you're supplying adequate fuel for everything, but not too much, but not too little. People who are hypothyroid tend to get lethargic and just kind of lying around and more pudged out. People who are hyperthyroid tend to get really jittery. Everything's kind of moving too fast. Their thoughts are skipping to the next thing before they finish with their first thought. They also tend to get, I'm not even sure why, but they end up getting what's called exophthalmosis, where your eyes start getting all bulgy, like Marty Feldman eyes kind of thing. Hyperthyroid. So controls metabolic rate. So that's one thing that the thyroid gland does. The other thing the thyroid gland does, it makes something called calcitonin. This is needed, this helps absorb and store calcium. So that's another thing made by the thyroid gland. And we're going to see that there is a sister hormone to this in just a moment coming from the parathyroids. So this is the thyroid gland. All right, let's go. So again, here we were looking at the thyroid gland. Sitting on the thyroid gland, but its own independent gland, is the parathyroid glands. There's actually usually like 4 little clusters of tissue on the backside of the thyroid gland. So they're called parathyroid, it means near the thyroid, but they're not part of the thyroid. They're just, it's kind of like, this mouse is not part of my face. It's just glommed onto my face, right? Right, so the parathyroid glands happen to be glommed on the back of the thyroid gland, but they're their own thing. They're their own cells. They make their own hormones triggered by their own things. So the parathyroid hormone tells body to release more calcium into the bloodstream. So this is where does the calcium come from? Where would you ever find calcium in the body if you need calcium released into your body?
In your bones?
Totally. Your bones are this crazy mineral reservoir. So basically, parathyroid hormone talks to these cells called osteoclasts, which dissolve a little bit of the bone matrix, and dissolve the bone and release calcium. In general, you have plenty of bone and it's all good. If this happens over a lifetime, in particular, if you start out with kind of smaller bone structure, you can ultimately get into, osteoporosis, where the bones become so kind of weakened by this process that they become, they'll snap. Like, classic thing, the little old lady who broke her hip. It wasn't like she fell and broke her hip. She took a step and her bone had been so weakened that it just broke under her own weight. And then she fell and hit the ground because her femur snapped as she stepped on it. So in general, though, you always have enough calcium because your bones are an unlimited supply of calcium, and the parathyroid glands are the ones that work to make sure that you release calcium into your body when you need it. They found these accidentally, kind of in a horrifying kind of way, they did these surgeries on people that were hyperthyroid, too much thyroid hormone. So they would go in and like cut out the thyroid gland, and it helped with the hyperthyroid. But then all of a sudden, these people had horrible mineral imbalances, and they realized, oh, darn, we did something we didn't mean to. So they realized, okay, there's something else going on that we didn't realize. And they realized not only did they get rid of the thyroid gland, but they actually took out this other gland that they didn't realize was sitting there that's super important for something else. So parathyroid glands. Continuing on our journey through the glands, can do the pancreas. Okay. People often talk about it looking like a big tadpole. Sitting kind of behind your stomach, retroperitoneal. You don't need to know the anatomical details of it. We've already met it in the digestive system. It has exocrine functions, right? What does it make as an exocrine gland, as a gland that secretes into ducts? What does it secrete out the pancreatic duct? Someone must have remembered from, we just talked about it, like last week.
Pancreatic juice for digestion.
Yeah, it's making all those enzyme juices, right? And also bicarbonate for neutralizing the stomach acid. Remember, this is the thing that's listening to both the secretin and the CCK. Definitely you want to kind of review that if that feels a little new. So exocrine, that is just your classic making stuff and delivering it through a duct, in this case to the duodenum. But then there are endocrine functions. In fact, this is one of the classic test question is, which major gland is both an important exocrine gland as well as an endocrine gland? And the answer is always the pancreas. It's really important for making stuff, delivering through ducts, the digestive juices to the small intestine, but also endocrine gland, making hormones that it delivers to the bloodstream. The hormones are made in these places. So hormones, let me just type it because I am being spazzy here. So it's going to be insulin and glucagon, which made in the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. So these islets of Langerhans are just like little pockets of tissue in the pancreas. Most of the pancreas is just making digestive juices, but scattered about within the pancreas are these little pockets. That's why they're called islets, little islands of glandular endocrine tissue that are making the insulin and the glucagon. And these are basically dealing with glucose. When glucose is going up in your blood, if blood glucose is going up, then insulin is released. Insulin is going to help bring it back down by telling your cells, take up this sugar. There's lots of sugar in the bloodstream. Let's take it up. Tells the liver, take this sugar and store it, make a bunch of glycogen So we have carbohydrate stored for a rainy day. So insulin is telling your cells to take up the sugar that's showing up in the bloodstream. It's telling the liver cells to store this excess carbohydrate. So we have a reservoir of carbohydrate. If your blood glucose is going down, then that's going to be the trigger for glucagon. Glucagon is going to try to bring it back up, primarily by telling the liver cells to release that stored carbohydrate back into the bloodstream. Turn on the enzymes that break the bonds between the glycogen, the glucose is in the glycogen, and free up the glucose so the glucose can get dumped back into the bloodstream. So that's what glucagon does. Glucagon brings the sugar back up if it's been falling. Insulin tells cells to take up the sugar if the sugar is rising in the bloodstream. And again, obviously, diabetes we talked a little bit about is when your insulin is not working right. In type 1 diabetes, diabetes mellitus, this is what we call juvenile onset as well. Here you just don't make insulin. Typically what's going on here is, again, an autoimmune kind of thing where your body attacks its islets of Langerhans. So you're just never making the insulin in the first place. In which case you have to monitor your blood glucose and you have to give yourself manual shots of insulin to keep your sugar levels right. Diabetes mellitus. Mellitus means sweet, because we talked about how when you have this, you tend to have glucose overflowing into your urine. So one of the ways to know that somebody has this is the urine smells sweet. I think old school, like the docs would literally kind of taste a little bit of the urine, and if it was really sweet, that would be a important clue that this person had diabetes mellitus. Type 2 diabetes, also called adult onset. You make insulin, but your cells stop responding to insulin. So this is it's the same basic, in the end, you have the same result. Like your glucose levels are not being regulated, but it's for a different reason. The pancreas is releasing the insulin, but the cells aren't responding to the message. And again, the problem here, this is often related to obesity. Often people who have this can actually have the situation get better just by losing weight. And again, it used to be adult onset. Now, especially because there's so much adolescent obesity or juvenile obesity, it's actually not that uncommon for it to occur in kids. So it's not always adult anymore. The other diabetes that I can just mention just for completeness is diabetes, versus diabetes insipidus. From its name, insipid, tasteless. The urine is not sweet. The urine, this is when your kidneys are not conserving water properly. In which case you just have huge volumes of dilute urine. So something has gone wrong with the way your kidneys do its water balance, and you start lose. So it's it's called diabetes still, but diabetes insipidus. So you should be aware that when we talk about diabetes more kind of casually, we're usually talking about diabetes mellitus, the sweet urine, versus diabetes insipidus. So for completeness, let me just, because I realize we are a couple of minutes over, but we can just do the adrenal gland in like 3 minutes and then take our break here. And then we will actually have finished the endocrine system here. So let's do that. Okay. So here's your kidneys, which we've talked a whole bunch about. And again, a lot of times the book talks about perched atop the kidneys like a little hat, you will find the adrenal glands. And so they are not part, again, it's kind of like the mouse on my face. They're not part of the kidney. They happen to be sitting on top of the kidney. Just like the mouse is not part of my face, it's sitting on my face. There are two parts to it. There's this inner part, the adrenal medulla. We have met the adrenal medulla. This is the part that makes epinephrine and releases it, I should say. So we've already covered that. Basically, adrenal medulla is epinephrine. What we need to talk about now is the adrenal cortex. And we'll just talk briefly. There are 3 layers to it. In fact, I will type to make my life easier here. So outer layer makes what are called mineralocorticoids. The main mineralocorticoid, in fact, the only one I know by name, is one you all know, aldosterone. What does aldosterone do?
It tells the kidneys to conserve.
Yes, it tells the kidneys to conserve sodium. It turns on these sodium pumps in the collecting ducts to pull sodium back into the body. So mineralocorticoids, it's dealing with mineral balance, and it's made by the cortex. Middle layer. They're called glucocorticoids. The main one here is cortisol. These are often called stress hormones. Cortisol, I'm going to get back to it in just 1 second. Just for completeness, I'm going to say inner layer makes sex hormones. So this idea that sex hormones are just in the gonads is not true. In fact, you have sex hormones in your body before you hit puberty and your gonads come online because the adrenal glands are making sex hormones. And while you're an adult, they're still making sex hormones as well. They're not as important a supply of sex hormones as your gonads, but they still do make them. But what I want to talk about now is cortisol. Again, which is what hormone triggers the release of cortisol by the adrenal glands? Anyone remember? I just mentioned at the beginning of class today.
The ACTH.
Yeah, that ACTH, that adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, which is also, this is made by the pituitary, which is ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It basically, the name glucocorticoids means it's making energy resources available, turns on lots of enzymes to release lots of sugar and make lots of ATP available for your body processes to deal with stress. Shuts down long-term repair and maintenance, and instead puts your body resources into dealing with a current stressor at the moment. The reason why, so in general, it's a good thing. If there's a stressor, you want to we don't have to worry about dealing with long-term maintenance repair. We need to put our resources into making sure we survive the stressor right now. But the problem is, particularly with kind of modern humans, there's kind of this constant state of anxiety and danger. There's this guy, Sapolsky, he's at Stanford. He's an endocrinologist. He's great. He'll talk about, one of his famous books is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he'll talk about a zebra is running from a lion, and in the moment, it's the next 5 minutes, either it's going to be dead or it's going to manage to escape. And it puts all its resources into that moment. And then it's either dead, let's say it's alive. If it makes it, it shakes it off, it goes back to eating grass. Whereas in humans, it's more like you just, oh my God, I can't believe I survived that zebra. I mean, that lion, it almost got me. I'm like, I could just see the fur on it. Oh my God. And what if it's going to come back? Oh my God. It's like the fact is humans keep reiterating things, keep elevated levels of cortisol, keep their bodies in these places where you're prepared for danger, but it's not actually helpful. And you're suppressing long-term maintenance. For instance, cortisol suppresses the immune system. I don't need to deal with kind of dealing with some virus if I'm about to get ripped apart by a lion. Plus inflammation is going to seize up my joints. I actually want to suppress inflammation in the moment so I can still run and stuff, even though my tissue's all damaged. But in the long term, you can watch, and it's like hypothalamus in your brain talking to the pituitary, which is releasing adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is talking to the adrenal gland to release cortisol. Just stress in your head, you can measure reduced white blood cell count in your body because you have elevated levels of stress hormone. So there's this real kind of connection between your mental status and these levels of stress hormones, which over the long term can cause these kind of degenerative diseases because your body is not being so good about doing maintenance and repairing and taking care of itself. Even in, so over the long term, it actually causes problems. Even if in this very moment, it's not making you sick, it can cause these diseases that if it's kind of keeps up, actually does make you sick. So there's lots of reasons why you want to try to avoid continually elevated levels of stress hormones in your body, because they're good to deal with stressors, but they're made to kind of come online or come offline depending on your body's needs, not to just be in a constant state of oh my God, now when I get in the grade, oh my God, then am I going to get into nursing school? Then am I going to get a job? And then and COVID's going to come back or whatever. So you need to find ways to kind of, relax. And so, relax is important, health, what do you call it? I don't know what I'm trying to say. Basically, figuring out how to deal with stress is important, not just because you feel better, but it's actually physically more healthy for you to not feel so stressed.